Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, February 6th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, U.S. officials soften aspects of Gaza takeover. So on Wednesday, Trump administration officials defended the president's surprise announcement on Tuesday night that he wants the U.S. to take over and own the Gaza Strip, but they appeared to walk back some aspects of the plan. So kind of got mixed things from Trump officials after this big announcement he made on Tuesday night. We have a lot of stories here kind of about the reaction to what Trump said. And Trump made the announcement after calling for Palestinians to be removed from Gaza permanently, which would mean ethnic cleansing, although he later suggested that some Palestinians could live there along with people of the world after the U.S. rebuilt it. When asked for clarification on Wednesday, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt said, quote, "They need to be temporarily relocated out of Gaza for the rebuilding," end quote. She said that the president had made it very clear that he expects Egypt and Jordan to take Palestinian refugees despite their strong opposition. Leavitt added that it was evil to expect Palestinians to live in Gaza under the current conditions, which obviously these conditions were created by the U.S.-backed Israeli bombing campaign and siege. So she's saying temporary, that's the line coming from the White House now. But of course, a plan to temporarily relocate Palestinians from Gaza to Arab states would still face resistance, since they would not expect Israel to actually let the Palestinians return. Some analysts have suggested the idea of relocating part of Gaza's population to the West Bank or Israel's Negev desert during reconstruction, but that does not appear to be under consideration by the U.S. I think that's something the Palestinians would go for much more easily, because Israel's not going to want them to stay in the West Bank or in the Negev desert, so it would make them much more likely to let them return to Gaza. But again, that doesn't seem like anything that's really on the table here. Leavitt also mentioned the idea of troops being sent there. Trump was asked about, does your plan mean that you're going to send troops? And he said that he would do that if necessary. And Leavitt said, quote, "It's been made very clear to the president that the United States needs to be involved in this rebuilding effort to ensure stability in the region for all people. That does not mean boots on the ground in Gaza. That does not mean American taxpayers will be funding this effort," end quote. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who appeared to endorse Trump's original plan on Tuesday night, also said on Wednesday that the idea was for temporary relocation. He said that the proposal, quote, "was not meant as hostile. It was meant as, I think, a very generous move, the offer to rebuild and to be in charge of the rebuilding," end quote. But it sounds like from what Trump said on Tuesday and from what the White House is saying, that the idea is for the Gulf Arab states to finance the reconstruction, which, as far as I understand, they've essentially committed to helping finance the reconstruction as part of the ceasefire deal, but that involves the Palestinians staying there. And practically speaking, relocating at least some of them temporarily would be beneficial for the construction. But the reality of the situation, of course, the very sensitive history that we're dealing with here, is that Israel probably wouldn't let them go back. So they would need guarantees. And I think the only real way to guarantee that is if they put them in somewhere in Israel or in the West Bank. But anyway, so on Wednesday, Witkoff, so this is something that I didn't mention in the show last night. I saw this right after I finished recording. Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy to the Middle East, I mean, it essentially sounded like he was endorsing this plan of ethnic cleansing. He said that a better life for the Palestinians is not necessarily tied to the physical space that they are in today. So that didn't sound very good. And then on Wednesday, Witkoff reportedly told Senate Republicans that Trump does not want to put any U.S. troops on the ground and that he does not want to spend any U.S. dollars at all. He also said that Trump had been gestating on this idea for some time, and other reports said that it was an idea the president had been working on with his inner circle, but it was a surprise to many members of the administration. It was just kind of his people that are close to him were aware of it. And then there is a quote from Mike Waltz, Trump's national security advisor, suggesting that Trump's plan was meant to open negotiations. Like I said yesterday, this is, people think this is him doing the art of the deal, making kind of an outrageous thing, and then to start negotiations. He said, quote, "The fact that nobody has a realistic solution," and he put some very bold, fresh, new ideas out on the table, "I don't think we should be criticized in any way. It's going to bring the entire region to come up with their own solutions if they don't like Mr. Trump's solution," end quote. Then I put a quote in here from Aaron Mate of the Gray Zone in response to what Waltz said about how the region has to come up with a solution. He mentions the Arab Peace Initiative, which this was first endorsed by the Arab League back in 2002, and this calls for Israel getting full normalization with everybody in the region in return for Israel ending its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and finally allowing a Palestinian state. So this has been the position of the Arab states for a long time, which for the Palestinians, it is a compromise. It's only 22% of their homeland that they would get. At the same time, the reality on the ground right now is that there's 500,000 Jewish Israeli settlers in the West Bank that are not going to want to give up that territory. But and Trump's proposal was resoundingly rejected by the Arab world, including Palestinians living in Gaza, who don't want to give up their homes even as they lie in ruin. Saudi Arabia rejected Trump's claims that he made that the Saudis would normalize with Israel without the establishment of a Palestinian state, and said that it opposed any effort to displace Palestinians. So the next one here, Jared Kushner behind Trump's call to take over Gaza. So the online news site Puck has reported that Jared Kushner was involved in crafting President Trump's plan for the U.S. to take over Gaza, which would involve the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian population. That's another thing. I mean, if this is really the plan, a U.S. takeover of Gaza, you see Witkoff, what's her name, the White House press secretary say, oh, Trump doesn't want to put any boots on the ground. Well, and how are you going to take over Gaza? I mean, it just doesn't really make sense. So Kushner, who has a very long history of friendship with Netanyahu, his family has known Netanyahu for a long time. He served as an advisor to President Trump during his first term in office, and he was involved in negotiating the Abraham Accords. And these deals, these normalization deals, sought Israel's regional integration without settling the issue of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory. And October 7th has shown that the only way to peace is to dealing with this issue of the occupation. So Kushner, who has no official position in the current White House, remarked last year that Gaza's waterfront property could be very valuable and said Palestinians should be removed from the territory, at least temporarily. If you remember this, I remember we covered on this show. So again, this is last year, and Kushner said, quote, "Gaza's waterfront property, it could be very valuable if people would focus on building up livelihoods. It's a little bit of an unfortunate situation there, but I think from Israel's perspective, I would do my best to move the people out and then clean it up. But I don't think that Israel has stated that they don't want the people to move back there afterward," end quote. So President Trump would not rule out the idea of sending troops. So there was a report from Axios that said Israeli officials visiting Washington felt almost jubilant by the announcement. And one official said that it exceeded all of their expectations and dreams. Other reports say that the Israelis were surprised that apparently Trump told Netanyahu about this right before the press conference. So, there's just so much about this. It was tough trying to figure out what to write, the reaction to what Trump has said. And one thing, when we talk about the negotiations, like I think the concession Trump's trying to get out of the Arabs is for them to take the Palestinians. I think that's exactly what's on his mind. And even if he's thinking it could be temporary, but I mean, you saw the other day, he's saying, no, we'll build in places so beautiful they won't even want to go back. I think his mind, it is, the idea is permanent. But I think that's the concession that he's trying to make, that he's trying to get from the Arab states. So I do think the plan, ethnic cleansing, is the ultimate plan. More with Israel taking the territory more so than the U.S. actually taking it. But, again, the response that we're seeing, I just don't think it's a realistic goal. I don't know. I mean, it would take just a lot of bloodshed. All right, so the next one here, settler leaders welcome Trump's call for ethnic cleansing in Gaza. So, of course, the settlers are happy about this. Israeli settler leaders have welcomed President Trump's call for Palestinians to be removed from the Gaza Strip and are calling for his plans to be implemented. So, according to the Times of Israel, Israel Gans, head of a settler group known as the Yesha Council, said Trump's plan amounted to, quote, declaring an end to the Palestinian dream to destroy Israel through Gaza or the establishment of a Palestinian state in the heart of the land of Israel, end quote. Gans said Israel would adopt Trump's vision today and said that Israel should adopt Trump's vision and translate it into action. And he said that the plan should also include the Israeli annexation of the Israeli-occupied West Bank. President Trump said on Tuesday that he was making a decision on the potential annexation within the next 4 weeks. He was asked if he would support it, and he said, I'm going to make a decision on it in a few weeks. He said 4 weeks, which is kind of oddly specific. So Ben-Gvir, who's a West Bank settler himself, he's the leader of Israel's Jewish Power Party, said that he would rejoin the Israeli government if Trump's plan is implemented. He just quit Netanyahu's coalition over the Gaza ceasefire plan, but he says if they start implementing this, if we go for it, then I'm back in. I'm in the government. Let's do it. So the next one here, Israel kills Palestinians in Gaza despite the ceasefire. Another thing about this is by what Trump's saying, it really threatens the ceasefire because it throws up into the air if this ceasefire is going to be implemented, and it's been shaky anyway. And now, I mean, if Hamas really thinks that Israel might try to go through with something like this, then who knows what they would do. And then Israel, this could embolden Israeli troops on the ground. And it looks like there was a lot of violence in Gaza on Wednesday, the day after Trump said this. So Al Jazeera reported that at least 2 Palestinians were killed by Israeli gunfire in the southern Gaza city of Rafah on Wednesday, despite the ceasefire. An Al Jazeera correspondent said that a child was killed by an Israeli sniper, which came a few hours after a Palestinian was shot and killed by Israeli forces east of the city. Another Palestinian died due to wounds sustained on the first day of the ceasefire in Rafah's al-Shabura refugee camp. So a Palestinian who was wounded by Israeli troops on the first day of the ceasefire died of his wounds. And then the Times of Israel had a report that actually put the death toll higher, saying that Palestinian media reported that 4 were killed by Israeli forces on Wednesday. The Israeli military acknowledged that it opened fire on Palestinians in several areas of Gaza. And last week, Gaza's health ministry said that more than 80 Palestinians had been killed since the ceasefire went into effect on January 19th, including 49 in Rafah. In each incident, it acknowledges the Israeli military claims that its troops opened fire on an imminent threat, but we know that the Israeli troops on the ground in Gaza basically have free reign to shoot whoever they want. And this became more clear after they killed an Israeli civilian contractor who was unarmed, dressed in civilian clothes, and just walking toward them. We got a lot more of the details about that incident because it was reported on more closely by Israeli media. I mean, this is what the Palestinians say is happening to them as well. But of course, that just doesn't get the attention. So again, this goes to show what they're firing at here. And another thing, you don't see Hamas, Islamic Jihad, making a big deal about the fact that Palestinians are still being killed. That shows that they want the ceasefire, the hostage exchanges to continue. But again, if they really think that they're going to try an ethnic cleansing plan, they're going to get ready to fight it, and we might start seeing them look for reasons to start firing at Israeli troops. And they have plenty of reasons to do that with these ceasefire violations and everything. So everything is just very shaky right now. All right, so the next one here, Palestinians reject Trump's call to expel them from Gaza. So this one is from AP News. So I ran a couple stories about this because I think it's kind of worth stressing the point. There's all these stories about interviews with Palestinians in Gaza, literally living in tents in front of their destroyed homes, saying, we're not leaving. And I'm sure that if some of them were given the opportunity to leave, especially people with babies and young families, that just for their own survival, I'm sure many of them would leave, but I'm also sure that many of them would stay. I mean, that's very clear. So Saeed Abu Alaish's wife, 2 of his daughters, and 24 others from his extended family were killed by Israeli airstrikes over the past 15 months. His house in northern Gaza was destroyed. He and surviving family now live in a tent set up in the rubble of his home. But he says he will not be driven out after President Donald Trump called for transferring all Palestinians from Gaza so the United States could take over the devastated territory and rebuild it for others. He said, quote, "We categorically reject and will resist any plans to deport and transfer us from our land," end quote. And he said this from the Jabalia refugee camp, which has been completely destroyed. So even the Palestinians from there, they're saying they're not going anywhere. And his family, were driven from their homes during the Nakba in 1948 and settled in the Jabalia refugee camp. So, the history here, this is all very important context that Trump clearly doesn't understand, or people in his administration. So that article has a few more interviews with Palestinians in Gaza. And then this next one here, again, is similar. Palestinians are outraged with the U.S. takeover plan. This one is from Haaretz, the Israeli media outlet. It says Palestinians from the Gaza Strip responded on Wednesday to U.S. President Donald Trump's proposal for a U.S. takeover of the Gaza Strip with shock, anxiety, and outrage. Mutasim Yassin, a 42-year-old social worker from Gaza City, said, quote, "He is a businessman and that is all he is ever going to be. His vision is limited to what he knows, a real estate project. He's not a military person or a politician," end quote. And he added that Trump sees the Palestinians as a stumbling block to his fantasy. And again, I mean, this is the message here from these Palestinians, is that they're not going anywhere. And Osama Rantisi, a 25-year-old Palestinian from Beit Lahia, another city that's been completely destroyed. He was a third-year law student when the Gaza war erupted 16 months ago. He said that he was astonished that Arab countries had not been consulted about the U.S. plan for Gaza. He said the people of Gaza, quote, "now more than ever feel the absence of a future, of our right to determine our own fate, and even the absence of a clear vision of what time may bring," end quote. And he says there's forces greater, basically saying we're not going anywhere, even after all this. And then there's another interesting quote in here, someone saying after all this, that they're even more committed to staying after all the death and destruction, because then what was the purpose of enduring it all if we're going to lose our home? So this does seem to be the prevalent attitude among the Palestinians on the ground. All right, so the next one here, Trump dismisses idea that the U.S. will bomb Iran. So on Wednesday, President Trump said reports about the U.S. and Israel planning an attack on Iran were greatly exaggerated, and he insisted that he wanted to deal with the Islamic Republic instead. He wrote on Truth Social, quote, "I want Iran to be a great and successful country, but one that cannot have a nuclear weapon. Reports that the United States, working in conjunction with Israel, is going to blow Iran into smithereens are greatly exaggerated. I would much prefer a verified nuclear peace agreement which will let Iran peacefully grow and prosper. We should start working on it immediately and have a big Middle East celebration when it is signed and completed. God bless the Middle East," end quote. So a day earlier, Trump signed an executive order reimposing the maximum pressure campaign, which involved sanctions, tearing up the nuclear deal, assassinating Soleimani. So there's one thing that he said that was interesting when he signed the order that Trita Parsi picked up, and I had missed this. While he was signing the order and talking to reporters, he said he acknowledged that Iranian leadership does not want a nuclear weapon. He said, quote, "There are many people at the top ranks of Iran that do not want to have a nuclear weapon," end quote. And Parsi thought that was very significant. He said this was that he could not recall any U.S. president ever deviating from the quasi-official American line that Tehran is dead set on getting nukes. So maybe a good sign, but at the same time, and Parsi gets into this in his article, which we ran it under this story, that if Trump does try to go through with this Gaza thing, I mean, all bets are off for any kind of deals with with anybody really in the region. All right, so the next one here, Pentagon is drafting Syria withdrawal plans. So NBC News reported on Wednesday that the Pentagon is drafting plans to withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria after President Trump and officials close to him expressed interest in the idea. Israeli media recently reported that the U.S. informed Israel it planned to pull out of Syria. Trump denied the report but added that Syria has got its own mess and doesn't need the U.S. involved. The NBC report said Pentagon officials have drawn up plans to pull all U.S. troops out of Syria within 30, 60, or 90 days. The U.S. currently has about 2,000 troops occupying eastern Syria, where it backs the Kurdish-led SDF, which has been fighting fierce battles with Turkish-backed factions in northern Syria. The idea of pulling out of Syria aligns with the view of Mike DiMino, a former CIA analyst who is now the Pentagon's Middle East policy chief. Before taking this post, he worked for Defense Priorities and was basically saying that the U.S. should pull troops out of both Syria and Iraq because they're very exposed and it could get the U.S. sucked into another major war in the region. So hopefully this happens. The real purpose of the U.S. occupation, they say it's about fighting ISIS, but the real purpose over the years was keeping Iran out of eastern Syria and putting pressure on Assad. It was a part of a broader regime change effort, which ultimately succeeded. So I think because of that, because Iran's ally is out and this Al-Qaeda offshoot's in charge, as crazy as that sounds, I think because of that, Trump might not face as much pressure if he goes to withdraw than he did in 2019. But, it's one of those things. Like, I remember following it and covering it at the time, the potential withdrawal from Syria. It was very frustrating because it seemed like it was going to happen and then it didn't. And then it seemed like it was going to happen again and then it didn't. So I'm not going to get my hopes too high here until we see something start happening. But I think the good sign is DiMino in the Pentagon. And it's not good, but the regime change could change the calculations. All right, the next one here. CENTCOM says 5 ISIS members killed in U.S.-backed airstrikes in Iraq. So U.S. Central Command said in a press release on Tuesday that its forces supported airstrikes near Kirkuk, Iraq on January 31st, and it claimed killed 5 ISIS operatives. The command said the airstrikes were carried out by Iraqi government security forces and enabled by the U.S. The command said, quote, an initial post-strike clearance found multiple explosive suicide belts and other materials, end quote. So it's 2025 and the U.S. is still at war in Iraq. They're saying that the Iraqi government actually launched the airstrikes, but they were enabled by the U.S. They wouldn't be able to carry out these operations. Well, that might not be true anymore, but the U.S. obviously helped them build up this air force and everything. So the thing about Iraq, the point that I always make is that for a couple of years now, well, almost 2 years, about a year and a half, the Prime Minister, Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, has been saying, we don't need help fighting ISIS. I mean, for years now, the government has been trying to get the U.S. to leave. The U.S. has a lot of leverage over Iraq. They control their money and their oil, and they don't really control the oil directly, but they can, with sanctions, they control who they trade with. They could shut that stuff off. They have serious leverage over Iraq. So that's how the U.S. has been able to stay. But al-Sudani more recently has been saying, we don't need your help fighting ISIS. Yet we saw under Biden, as I covered, U.S. operations against ISIS in Iraq actually ramped up during the time that Sudani was saying that. And now they're still continuing to be involved. So hopefully if a Syria withdrawal happens, an Iraq withdrawal happens as well. That was another big argument for staying in Iraq, was that it supports the occupation of Syria. All right, so the next one here, Israel bombs southern Lebanon town of Yaroun. This one is from Jason Ditz. So Israel's demolition of civilian homes and infrastructure continues in southern Lebanon despite the ongoing ceasefire. On Wednesday, this centered on the town of Yaroun in the Bint Jebel district where Israeli bombings were reported. The bombings were reported as the systematic demolitions of homes in the residential part of town. This isn't new, as Israel has been burning and bombing residences across southern Lebanon throughout the ceasefire. Although these incidents have been widely reported, Israel has typically not commented on them. The villages the IDF has withdrawn from so far have been virtually destroyed, with the vast majority of homes gone and the infrastructure ruined. In towns like Yaroun, signs warn civilians to stay away, and Israeli snipers are positioned on the outskirts to ensure that they don't approach while this occupation demolition goes on. So, I mean, look at this picture. This is in one of the towns in the south. There's major destruction. And this is another hot, flashpoint where things could really escalate if Hezbollah starts, firing back at Israel. All right, so the next one here, Trump is sending migrants to GITMO torture prisons. So this one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The Donald Trump administration is sending some illegal immigrants deported from the U.S. to the military prison at Guantanamo Bay. The facility was constructed by the George W. Bush administration to house detainees in the CIA torture program. Initially, the White House said the migrants would be imprisoned at a separate facility in U.S.-occupied Cuba at the same Guantanamo base, but at a separate facility. But it turns out they're sending some to GITMO, to the infamous torture prison. And that just has very bad implications. That means that that GITMO is not closing down anytime soon. And I mean, I don't know. I should try to look into this more, but I don't know about the who are these migrants, what crimes have they committed, and everything. Because if you're sending them to GITMO, it doesn't sound like they're going to be getting out anytime soon. All right, so the next one here, the last story: Russia slams Zelensky's request for nukes. This is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. So Ukrainian President Zelensky recently demanded that Kiev either receive NATO membership or nuclear weapons. The Kremlin said the Ukrainian leader's remarks were bordering on madness. In an interview with Piers Morgan published on Tuesday, Zelensky said, quote, "So let's do it the following way. Give us back nuclear arms, give us missile systems, partners, help us finance the 1 million man army, move your contingent on the parts of our state where we want," end quote. On Wednesday, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov responded to Zelensky's remarks, quote, "Such statements and remarks in general border on madness. There is a non-proliferation regime for nuclear weapons, among other things. One hopes that despite the current generation of European politicians leaving much to be desired in terms of qualifications, some sober understanding of the absurdity and potential danger of discussing such a topic still exists in Europe," end quote. So he's basically saying it's delusional. They're not going to give them nuclear weapons. And I think that's right. It is delusional. It's not serious demands that he's making, and it's just not a good sign for the prospect of a peace deal. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints, one from Jonathan Cook. 30 years of Middle East lies just keep coming back to bite us. One from Dan Steinbach, ethnic cleansing for Gaza's Riviera. One from Aaron Sobsack, no, Christians should not give unconditional support to Israel. And I very much agree with that. That's over at the Libertarian Christian Institute. One from Ted Snyder, bet you never thought you'd miss the rules-based order. And the spotlight is from Daniel Larison, the rivalry peril with China, toxic Cold War is where we are headed. So please go check all of that out. Check out our blog. We have Ron Paul's show reposted in there. His take on what Trump said about Gaza. A good article from Matt Ho about Gaza. We repost Kyle Anzalone's great show, Conflicts of Interest. Lots of good content. And then there's lots of other news stories in the lower part of the page, all organized into nice little sections for you. So just because you listen to the show doesn't mean you should not go visit antiwar.com today. So that's everything. You could always support us by liking, subscribing, commenting. Another thing, Defend the Guard. I mentioned that it passed the Virginia House yesterday, which was very exciting. They need volunteers for the phone banking. So if you go in the description, you'll always find the link to phone banking with Defend the Guard. That is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.